On today's program, we will be bringing you the second part, a mini debate between Professor Chomsky and O.Baddar, the Executive Director of the ADCMA. Their mini debate was Perspectives on the Israel Lobby. Without further delay, let us now go to Boston University with Professor Noam Chomsky and O.Baddar.
Let me first start by saying that it was exposure to Professor Chomsky's analysis roughly 9 years ago at age 17 that sort of got me to begin to think critically about world affairs. So I have tremendous respect and admiration for him, and I'm actually honored to be sharing a panel with him. I got a message recently from a student at Brandeis University, somebody who clearly knows nothing about either my views or Professor Chomsky's views about the Israel lobby. And basically he was outraged at the thought that I would be debating Professor Chomsky, saying a debate is supposed to be between people who disagree with each other, and here you have Professor Chomsky debating some guy from an Arab organization. Yeah, right, some debate. Which I guess is a really good point, given the fact that there is a monolithic view that all Arabs subscribe to at birth or something, which apparently Professor Chomsky happened to get in the wrong line at that subscription process or something.
But in reality, within people who actually understand the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and who share a critique of U.S. policy towards it, there is a debate over what actually drives that policy. On one end of the spectrum, you have people like Professors Mearsheimer and Walt, who argue that the Israel lobby essentially overrides independent U.S. policy preferences to the detriment of U.S. interests, and they go as far as to say that the invasion of Iraq was in large part due to the Israel lobby's influence. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have people like Stephen Zunes and Professor Chomsky and others who basically say that the Israel lobby really hardly has any independent influence.
And that it only appears to be powerful because its agenda happens to mesh pretty well with that of the centers of power in the U.S. And furthermore, those policies are not basically harming U.S. interests as defined by those centers of power. Now, I think that neither perspective is entirely accurate in that while Mearsheimer and Walt definitely exaggerate the extent of the Israel lobby's influence on foreign policy, I still do think that a strong argument could be made that the Israel lobby has driven policy in a way that was harmful to U.S. interests. Now, when I talk about the Israel lobby, I basically accept a variation of the definition of Mearsheimer and Walt of it. Not the original one that came out in their paper. That was a bit too broad and vague, and for that matter, bordered tautology in that it basically said anybody who's ever lobbied for the interests of Israel is part of the lobby. But they take a more sophisticated definition of that in their book, which is the one that I sort of think is somewhat accurate. So when I say the lobby, I'm talking about national organizations whose primary and explicit purpose is the promotion of Israel's interests in the United States. So we're talking about groups like AIPAC, the Zionist Organization of America, the Israel Project, Christians United for Israel, as well as media watchdog groups whose basically primary purpose is to tilt media coverage in Israel's favor, groups like Camera and Honest Reporting and others. And then on top of that, there are allied groups to the lobby. Those are groups or organizations whose, even though the interests of Israel are not their primary focus, they nevertheless happen to basically mesh with those of the main organizations. And here I'm talking about the broader right-wing Christian evangelical movement, think tanks who basically their views of analysis on world affairs are tinted through Israeli eyes, like the Washington Institute of Near East Policy and other organizations that basically happen to share the views and the interests of major pro-Israel organizations. And in mainstream political science literature, basically the determinants of success for interest groups have been fairly outlined. They include things like membership size, financial resources, unity, institutional complexity, access to power, coalition building, and so on. And I don't really have time to get into how the Israel lobby measures up on each one of these, but suffice it to say that it measures up very well. In fact, the Israel lobby is extremely powerful in a way that basically every mainstream political scientist does acknowledge. If you want those details, basically you can read, for example, the Mearsheimer-Walt book. And Then you look at U.S. policy towards Israel. You see that Israel is the single largest recipient of U.S. foreign aid, receiving roughly $3 billion a year, 3/4 of which is military aid, and it's about. Here we go. Is yours still working?
This one working? Yeah.
All right. You see that Israel is the single largest recipient of U.S. foreign aid, receiving roughly $3 billion each year, 2/3 of which is military aid, and that's about to be converted into entirely, in its entirety, to military aid as well. You also see that Israel is the only country that receives that aid all in one allocation at the beginning of each fiscal year, is not basically required to account for it. Israel receives privileged intelligence from the United States and is allowed to develop nuclear weapons when many other countries obviously are under the threat of force over the thought. And then you look at U.S. policy towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. To reiterate something that Professor Chomsky just said, essentially there has been a practical solution on the table, not a perfect one, but a practical one, for over 20 years now, which calls for Israel to withdraw from the occupied territories to facilitate the creation of a Palestinian state. The Palestinians accepted this, so did the Arab League and virtually the entire international community through the United Nations. And Israel is single-handedly essentially blocking the solution. And the U.S. is backing them up. I mean, even not just with continued military and financial support, but also diplomatically. The U.S. has vetoed over 40 UN resolutions that are critical of Israel's violations of international law and human rights, which is, to put that in perspective, is greater than the number of vetoes used by all other permanent members of the UN Security Council combined on all matters. So it is kind of an obscene figure. So you look at the Israel lobby and you say it's powerful, and then you look at U.S. policy towards Israel and you see unrestrained support. And people might feel tempted to come to the conclusion that the Israel lobby is responsible for this policy. But it's not quite that simple, because there are other forces that could account for that policy as well. For example, Israel has been of extreme strategic utility to the U.S. They defeated Nasser's nationalism in 1967, which the U.S. really needed. They protected King Hussein's regime during the events of Black September from Syrian intervention. They supplied weapons to apartheid South Africa and the Contras in Latin America at a time when it would look bad for the U.S. to do that directly and, in fact, illegal. And basically, Israel is the dominant military force in the Middle East, and it's a stable one. So that makes it extremely important for the United States strategically. So even the U.S. grand strategy could also account for U.S. support for Israel. Furthermore, U.S. military aid that goes to Israel, basically huge parts of it, something close to 70%, comes back to U.S. military corporations. So in essence, U.S. military aid to Israel is a form of subsidy to U.S. military corporations. So you can see that the defense establishment would also be in favor of this strong relationship. So given the fact that the defense establishment, the U.S. grand strategy, and the Israel lobby all advocate a policy, when you have multiple players, it becomes a bit difficult to isolate and assess the influence of one particular player, and in this case, that's the Israel lobby. And the way to resolve this is to look at cases where the Israel lobby alone contradicted, basically was in conflict with the other forces that support this current policy. Now, unfortunately, the record does not resolve this problem because the record shows mixed results. So, for example, Professor Chomsky and others have pointed to the 2005 incident when Israel sold sophisticated military technology to China against U.S. wishes. The U.S. essentially humiliated Israel, and the lobby didn't say a word. They forced Israel to apologize publicly, which they did. In 1993, there was the incident where Israel was working out a deal with North Korea by which North Korea would cease to provide long-range missiles to Iran in return for Israeli investments in North Korea, which, you know, when you're talking about missiles to Iran, this is something of serious strategic national security interest for Israel. And the U.S., in an effort to isolate North Korea, was basically able to compel Israel to end the deal. And in both those cases, the lobby, didn't say a word. And even in cases where the lobby did get active protesting, for example, there was the case of 1981 when the United States wanted to sell, the Reagan administration wanted to sell advanced radar systems to Saudi Arabia. the Israel lobby essentially threw a fit, and they got very active, and they gave the administration a very difficult time, and they almost canceled the deal. Only here, the defense industry, namely Boeing and United Technologies, basically who had hundreds of millions of dollars on the deal, basically got together and said that they were not going to allow this to happen. And sure enough, in cooperation with the Saudis and with the administration that was bent on getting this through, they were able to crush the lobby's opposition, and the deal actually went through. So all of these cases demonstrate the limits of the Israel lobby's influence. But on the other hand, Mir Shamar and Walt can point to cases where the Israel lobby did overcome administration opposition. So, for example, in 2002, Ariel Sharon launched Operation Defensive Shield in the West Bank, killing hundreds of Palestinians at a time when Bush basically was trying to gather up support for the Iraq War.